This is a summary of Joseph Butler's sermon number 10 entitled Upon Self-Deceit. And the Bible verse is from 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7, where Nathan says to David, "Thou art the man." And this sermon's about being honest with yourself. So the story of Nathan and David is when the prophet Nathan confronts David about his adulterous affair with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband. And Nathan uses a parable in order to confront David. He tells the story of this poor man who has this single lamb that he loves very much, and this rich man who has lots of sheep. The rich man has a guest one day, comes over, and instead of not wanting to use one of his own sheep, he steals the lamb from the poor man and kills it and serves it up to this guest. This angers David very much, and David says, this man is guilty and needs to repay fourfold what he took from the poor man. And then Nathan turns to him and says, "Thou art the man. You are the one who took the lamb from the husband, the wife from the husband, and has done something just as guilty, even worse than what happened here." And so it's a really interesting story. The point of the sermon, though, is to talk about this idea of partiality to self and how partiality to self can blind us from our own flaws, so we don't see our own flaws. It's also about hypocrisy. And so we talk very strongly about the sins of others, the wrongdoings of others, but we are blind to the ones in ourselves. So he discusses how it's a fact of human nature that we overrate our own moral characters. We think more highly about ourselves than we ought to. He says there's some people who tend only to see their own good sides, and they don't see the bad. There are others who are more honest with themselves, so they see the good, maybe some of the good and some of the bad, but only to a degree. So there's still going to be some blind spots in their lives. He says there are two types of wickedness. There's the type that result from ungoverned passions or ungoverned emotions. So like he uses the example of murder and robbery. And then there are the types that result because of a corrupted understanding or corrupted judgment. And he thinks it's that this latter type is more dangerous or more serious than the former type, because it interferes with our conscience so that we don't see what we ought to see. We don't understand what is right or wrong. He says that this explains why we are blind when we're reading scripture or reading some moral teachings, and we come across some passage that would directly apply to us in our situation. We don't even recognize it because our understanding has been corrupted. Our judgment has been corrupted by this temper, which he calls the temper of self-deceit. So he says some areas and actions are more prone to self-deception than others. He says that when it comes to things that are stated explicitly in laws, like in the Ten Commandments, "Thou shalt not murder," these laws can't be broken while you're pleading ignorance, right? Because and everybody knows that murder is wrong. Nevertheless, he says in section 10, quote, "A great part, perhaps the greatest part, of the intercourse among mankind cannot be reduced to fixed determinate rules. Yet in these cases there is a right and a wrong, a merciful, a liberal, a kind and compassionate behavior, which surely is our duty." And so he's talking about a realm of moral rules that is more subtle, that because they're not explicitly written down or codified in law, that these become that it's more easy to deceive oneself about them and to not see them as applying to you or just be blind to them. So it's easy to deceive yourself in this area. In the next section, moving on to section 11, he talks about this bad temper of self-deception that darkens the understanding. He says, the temper itself, quote, "The temper itself is essentially in its own nature vicious and immoral. It is unfairness, it is dishonesty, it is falseness of heart, and is therefore so far from extenuating guilt that it is itself the greatest of all guilt in proportion to the degree it prevails." So very serious words about this practice of self-deception. He then talks about how some people he talks about this thing, I'll call it the inkling. He says that some people don't admit how bad they are. They don't even see how bad they are in their characters. But he says most people have a sense of it, and we'll call this the inkling. But they close their eyes to it because it's just too difficult to pay attention to that part of yourself that has all these flaws. He uses the example of somebody in debt. Somebody may know that their financial situation is bad, and they may know they're in debt, but they don't want to look very closely because that would just tell them how bad things are. So this is analogous, he says, to someone who is in moral trouble. Like they may know that they're not happy, they may know that their life is not a good one, but they don't want to attend too much to the details because that would be just too difficult. Even though it might help them to attend to the details to get out of their problem, it's just too difficult. Okay, in section 13, he starts talking about how to avoid self-deceit or self-deception. And so he says that, he says in the end of section paragraph 13, he says, every man, quote, may take for granted that he has a great deal of this self-deception until from the strictest observation upon himself he finds himself particular reason to think otherwise. In other words, we should all begin with the assumption that we are self-deceived. We see it in others. It's easier to recognize in others that other people don't see their own sins. Well, if we would just apply that to ourselves, let's just go ahead and assume that that's true in ourselves as well, and that will make us more cautious and more reflective going forward. He also includes in section 14 what is called the enemy test, and he says, consider what your worst enemy would say about you if they had the chance, what charges they would level against you if they had the chance. If they really wanted to bring you down and take you down, what would they say about you? And whatever you imagine they might say about you is probably the area of your life that you need to be most careful and most reflective about. And then finally, in section 15, he brings up the golden rule, and he says, imagine someone else doing what you want to do. Imagine you being the victim or the recipient of that action, and that will help give you better perspective and check your blindness in this area. Okay, hopefully that was helpful.